A mysterious encounter with near-frozen twin boys leads a wealthy man to make an impossible choice. But years later, when he comes back, what he finds will leave him in tears. The bitter winter wind howled through the streets like a restless spirit, tearing through the trees and rattling the windows of every house in the quiet, snow-covered town. It was the kind of night where people stayed huddled inside, wrapped in blankets, safe from the unforgiving cold. But for two little boys, there was no warmth to run to, no soft light waiting for them in the distance. Just the endless stretch of icy pavement beneath their bare, blistered feet. The twins, no older than 5, held on to each other, their tiny fingers interlocked as if letting go would mean disappearing into the darkness. Their lips were tinged blue, their breath coming out in weak, shaky puffs. Snowflakes settled onto their tangled hair, melting into their too-thin clothes. Their fragile bodies trembled, their eyes, once bright with childhood wonder, now hollow with exhaustion and hunger. A car, sleek and black, rolled slowly down the deserted road, its headlights slicing through the thick curtain of falling snow. Inside, Gabriel Thornton barely registered the wipers swiping across the windshield. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the weight of his own life. A multi-millionaire with everything money could buy, yet nothing that truly mattered. His phone vibrated against the dashboard, a reminder of the meeting he was supposed to be at. A meeting about expanding his empire, as if another property, another deal, would fill the void in his chest. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The holidays were approaching, and he felt nothing but emptiness. Then, something on the side of the road caught his eye. 2 small figures huddled beneath a flickering street lamp, snow piling up around them. Children, alone. Gabriel's foot pressed the brake instinctively, his heart lurching in a way he didn't understand. He pulled the car to the curb, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at them. What were they doing out here? Where were their parents? For a moment he considered driving away. This isn't your problem. But then one of the boys lifted his head. Big, round eyes, glassy with unshed tears, met Gabriel's through the frosted windshield. And just like that, something inside him cracked. He couldn't leave. Not this time. Gabriel stepped out of the car, the freezing air biting into his skin. He wasn't dressed for this, just a cashmere coat over his expensive suit, but none of that mattered now. He took slow, cautious steps toward the children, not wanting to startle them. "Hey," he called softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you okay?" The smaller of the twins shrank back, pressing himself closer to his brother, as if trying to disappear into him. But the other one, the one who had met his gaze, didn't move. He just stared, unblinking, his little chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Gabriel knelt to their level, his heart hammering. "Where are your parents?" No answer. The wind howled louder, and Gabriel noticed the way the boys' bodies trembled violently. If they stayed out here any longer? "You're going to freeze," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe." The smaller twin whimpered, his grip tightening around his brother's arm. Gabriel's throat tightened. What had happened to these boys? How long had they been out here? Then the older twin, Gabriel could tell now, just barely, that he was a few minutes ahead of his brother in birth, spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Grandma's house." Gabriel exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay," he said. "I'll take you there." The twins hesitated for only a moment before, finally, the older one reached out. His tiny, frozen fingers slipped into Gabriel's warm palm, sealing something between them that neither of them could understand just yet. Gabriel lifted the boys gently, carrying them to his car. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. The drive was silent, except for the quiet sniffles of the younger twin. Gabriel kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, his chest aching at how small they looked in his massive car. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The older twin hesitated before whispering, "Elliot." Gabriel glanced at the other boy. And yours? The younger twin wiped his nose with his sleeve. Ethan, he mumbled. Elliot and Ethan. Gabriel nodded, rolling the names over in his head. He didn't know why, but they already felt important to him. Like something permanent. When they finally reached their grandmother's house, a tiny run-down cottage on the outskirts of town, Gabriel hesitated before knocking on the door. A frail woman opened it, her wrinkled face pale with worry. When she saw the boys, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, my babies!" Elliot and Ethan ran into her arms, burying their faces in her tattered shawl. Gabriel swallowed hard, watching as she held them close, whispering prayers of gratitude. Then she turned to him, eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found them." Gabriel nodded, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. He glanced at the boys once more before stepping back. He had done what he could. It was time to walk away. Gabriel drove away that night, telling himself he had done the right thing. He had saved them. That was enough. And yet, as the miles stretched between him and that little house, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Why did it feel like he was leaving something behind? Why did it feel like this story wasn't over? He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had a life to return to, a business empire waiting for him, and yet, for the first time in years, it all felt meaningless. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that one day he would return to that little house, and what he would find there would change everything. 10 years later. The scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled Gabriel Thornton's office as he leaned back in his leather chair, staring blankly at the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a breathtaking view of the empire he had built, one deal, one acquisition at a time. Yet, as he sat in the penthouse of his high-rise, surrounded by luxury, all he felt was exhaustion. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. The years had passed in a blur of board meetings, wealth accumulation, and hollow accomplishments. He had everything he had once dreamed of, yet something was missing. A part of himself he had lost along the way. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Sir, your 2 o'clock meeting is ready." Gabriel straightened. "I'll be right there." He reached for his watch, an expensive heirloom that once belonged to his father. But as his fingers brushed the cool metal, something unexpected surfaced in his mind. A different winter, a different kind of cold. A pair of wide, frightened eyes staring at him through a snowstorm. Elliot, Ethan. Gabriel stilled, his pulse quickening. He hadn't thought about them in years, not really. He had convinced himself that night had been just another moment in passing. A good deed, nothing more. But why now? Why, after all this time, did the memory return with such force? Gabriel shook his head and stood, pushing the thought away. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was calling him back. A week later, Gabriel found himself gripping the steering wheel as he drove through the quiet streets of the town he had long left behind. He had told himself he was only visiting for business, to oversee a new property investment on the outskirts. But that was a lie. Something deeper had pulled him back. The house came into view. It was smaller than he remembered, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with dust. The once lively garden was now overgrown, its flowers long withered. His chest tightened. What had happened here? He stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, hesitating before knocking. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood before him, her face weary, her once bright eyes dull with age. Recognition flickered across her features. You're the man who found them that night." Gabriel nodded, a strange lump forming in his throat. "Yes." Her lips trembled. "You shouldn't have come." A cold chill ran down his spine. "Why?" Her gaze darkened, and when she spoke, her voice broke. "They're gone." Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. "Gone?" She swallowed hard, stepping aside. He hesitated before stepping inside, the air heavy with dust and something else. Something unsaid. The living room was sparse, old furniture, faded photographs on the mantel. His eyes immediately landed on two frames. He stepped closer. Two boys stared back at him, older now. Elliot, Ethan. They looked so different from the trembling children he had rescued, but their eyes were still the same. His fingers grazed the edge of the frames. "Where are they?" The grandmother exhaled shakily, sinking into a chair. "I tried. I really did," she whispered. "But after a while, I couldn't take care of them the way they needed. Money was tight. The world is cruel to boys like them." Gabriel's heart pounded. What happened? She stared at the floor, her voice hollow. "They ended up in foster care." The words hit him like a blow. Foster care. He clenched his fists, his stomach twisting. He had left that night thinking they would be safe, that he had done the right thing. And yet, he had abandoned them to a fate far worse. Gabriel swallowed hard. "Where are they now?" She hesitated before pushing a crumpled paper across the table. "This was the last address I got before the letters stopped coming." Gabriel picked up the paper, his chest tightening at the unfamiliar city name scribbled across it. His pulse roared in his ears. He had to find them. Tracking them down wasn't easy. The system was complicated, full of closed doors and red tape. But Gabriel Thornton was not a man who took no for an answer. He poured through records, called old caseworkers, and followed every possible lead. Days turned into weeks. Then, finally, he found them. The address led him to a rundown boxing gym on the outskirts of the city. The sound of fists hitting a punching bag echoed through the air as he stepped inside, the scent of sweat and old leather thick around him. And then, he saw them. Two young men. Elliot, now 16, moved with precision, his fists connecting with the bag in rhythmic strikes. His body had grown lean with muscle, his face sharper, older. But his eyes, they still held the same quiet intensity. And beside him stood Ethan, watching intently, his expression hardened by something Gabriel couldn't yet name. Gabriel's breath hitched. For a long moment he just stood there, unable to move. Then, as if sensing him, Elliot turned. Their eyes met. A flicker of recognition flashed across Elliot's face before it twisted into something else, something raw, anger, hurt. "You," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel took a tentative step forward. "Elliot. Ethan." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "What are you doing here?" Gabriel's throat tightened. "I've been looking for you." Elliot's jaw tensed. "Funny, you didn't look for us when we were starving in group homes, or when we had to fight to survive." Gabriel's heart twisted. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Ethan scoffed. "You left us." Silence. Gabriel swallowed the lump in his throat. "I want to fix it." Elliot's eyes darkened. "You can't." And with that, he turned away, landing another punch on the bag, this time harder. Gabriel's breath shook as he watched them. He had found them, but he had never felt farther from them in his life. Gabriel didn't leave. He came back, every day, watching from a distance, waiting for the wall between them to crack. He learned things. That Elliot had taken up boxing to protect Ethan, that Ethan was the quiet one, the one who carried scars in silence, that they had been abandoned too many times to trust easily. But trust was something that could be rebuilt. It started small. A conversation here, a hesitant glance there. One day, after weeks of silence, Elliot finally asked, "Why now?" Gabriel inhaled deeply. "Because I was a coward before, and I don't want to be one anymore." Elliot studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he didn't turn away. Just when things started to mend, everything shattered. A letter arrived, one that changed everything. Elliot and Ethan's biological father, who had vanished years ago, had returned, and he wanted them back. The man was dangerous, and Gabriel knew if he didn't fight for them now, they would be lost forever. Gabriel stood at the courthouse steps, his pulse hammering. He wasn't just fighting for them, he was fighting for redemption, for the chance to be the father they never had. And as he walked into the courtroom, one thought echoed in his mind. I will not fail them again. The courtroom battle begins. Gabriel had faced powerful men before, ruthless competitors, billionaire rivals, business moguls who would do anything to win. But none of them terrified him as much as the man sitting across the courtroom today. Mark Holloway, Elliot and Ethan's biological father. A man with sharp eyes and a cruel smile. A man who had abandoned them as infants, only to return when he learned they were worth something. Gabriel's fists clenched at his sides as the judge called the session to order. He had spent months fighting to gain custody of the twins. Months proving that their father had no right to them. But Mark had resources now. Money, lawyers, lies crafted so well they sounded like truths. Gabriel stole a glance at Elliot and Ethan, who sat stiffly beside him. Elliot's jaw was locked tight, his hands curled into fists. Ethan kept his head down, his fingers gripping the edge of his sleeve like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. They were scared, and Gabriel couldn't blame them, because if he lost today, they would be sent back to him. Mark's attorney stood, his voice smooth and polished. Your Honor, my client is simply a father trying to reclaim the sons who were unjustly taken from him. Gabriel's blood boiled. Mark leaned back in his chair, feigning sorrow. I made mistakes, Your Honor, but I was young. I was lost. I never stopped thinking about them, and when I finally got back on my feet, I searched for them. But they had been taken, without my consent, into the system. He turned toward the twins with a practiced look of remorse. I never stopped loving you boys. Elliot scoffed under his breath. Gabriel clenched his jaw. He had prepared for this. He knew Mark would paint himself as the victim. But it was what he said next that sent ice through Gabriel's veins. I was devastated when I found out that a stranger had been spending time with them, Mark continued, flicking his gaze toward Gabriel. A businessman. A man with no biological connection to them. A man who, let's be honest, probably sees them as a charity case, a way to ease his conscience. Gabriel's breath hitched. Mark's lawyer seized the moment. Mr. Thornton is a wealthy and influential man, Your Honor. But does that make him fit to raise two teenage boys? He may have money, but what about love? What about family? Gabriel's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. They were twisting the truth, making him the villain. But the worst part? For a second, just a second, he saw doubt flicker in Elliot's eyes. And that shattered him. After the court adjourned for the day, Gabriel caught up to Elliot and Ethan outside the courthouse steps. The air was thick with tension. Elliot turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Why are you doing this? Gabriel exhaled. Because I care about you. Because I don't trust that man with your lives. Elliot's eyes narrowed. You say you care, but we barely know you. The words hit Gabriel like a slap. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his voice small. Mark's a liar. We know that, but what if he's telling the truth about one thing? Gabriel frowned. What do you mean? Elliot hesitated, then met his gaze with quiet anger. What if you're just another person who's going to leave? Silence. Gabriel felt something deep inside him crack. That was what this was really about. Abandonment. Elliot and Ethan had spent their entire lives being left behind. By their parents, by the system, by people who swore they cared, then walked away. And now, standing in front of Gabriel, they were terrified he would be next. Gabriel's chest ached. He took a slow step forward. I won't leave. Elliot's jaw clenched. That's what everyone says. And then he turned, pulling Ethan with him. Gabriel watched them walk away, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly losing them. That night, Gabriel sat alone in his penthouse, staring at his untouched glass of whiskey. His mind was a storm. He had done everything right, hired the best lawyers, provided stability, given them a chance at a future. But Mark's words had planted a seed, not in him, in them. And that seed was growing into doubt, anger, fear. Then, his phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Gabriel's stomach twisted as he read it. Mark Halloway just received an anonymous financial backing. His legal team is now twice as strong. Gabriel's blood ran cold. Who would fund a man like Mark? Who had that much power? Then the second message came. It was someone from your company. Gabriel shot to his feet, his heart pounding. Someone he trusted had betrayed him. Gabriel had spent his life building an empire, but tonight, none of it mattered. Someone in his company had paid to keep Mark in the fight, and he had to find out who. Gabriel made one call. Jason, his most trusted advisor, picked up on the first ring. "Boss?" Gabriel's voice was sharp. "Find out who it was. I want every financial record, every transfer, I don't care what it takes." Jason hesitated. "Gabriel, I think I already know." Gabriel's pulse roared in his ears. "Who?" A heavy silence. Then, "Your assistant, Henry." Gabriel felt his stomach drop. Henry, his right-hand man, the one person who had been at his side for years. Gabriel's grip tightened around his phone. "Get me everything." Jason's voice was grim. "I'm on it." As Gabriel ended the call, something inside him changed. This wasn't just about Elliot and Ethan anymore. This was war. The next morning, Gabriel arrived at the courthouse early. His lawyer was already waiting. "Do you have the proof?" Gabriel asked. His lawyer nodded. "We're ready." Gabriel turned as the courtroom doors opened. Elliot and Ethan stepped inside. Their eyes landed on him. For the first time, Elliot didn't look angry. He looked uncertain. Gabriel took a breath and walked toward them. "Before this begins, I need you to know something." Elliot crossed his arms. "What?" Gabriel met his gaze head-on. "Someone betrayed me. Someone inside my company funded your father's legal team. They did it to make me lose." Elliot stiffened. "Who?" Gabriel exhaled. "My own assistant." Silence. Ethan's fingers tightened around his sleeve. "Why?" Gabriel's voice was steady. "Because some people don't believe in family. They only believe in power." Elliot swallowed hard. Gabriel took a slow step closer. "But I do. And I will fight for you, Elliot. For both of you. No matter what it takes." The courtroom doors opened wider. Mark was waiting. Elliot looked between Gabriel and the man who had hurt them. Then finally, he made his choice. Elliot turned to Gabriel and nodded. Gabriel's chest tightened. He reached out, tentatively. Elliot hesitated. Then, for the first time, he took Gabriel's hand. And in that moment, Gabriel knew. This wasn't over. But they had just taken their first step forward. The gavel struck the wood. Temporary custody is granted to Gabriel Thornton until further investigation. The words should have been a victory. They should have felt like triumph. But as Gabriel watched Mark Halloway storm out of the courtroom, his veins pulsing with barely restrained rage, he knew this fight was far from over. And he was right. Because that very night, Ethan ran away. Gabriel's phone rang just past midnight, his lawyer's voice tense. "He's gone." Gabriel bolted upright. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Elliot woke up and he wasn't there. He took a bag, no note, nothing. Gabriel's chest tightened. His mind raced, trying to piece together the why. Ethan had been quiet since the trial, withdrawn. Was he scared? Did he feel like he didn't belong? Or, worse, had Mark gotten to him? Gabriel grabbed his keys, his heart hammering. He wasn't going to lose Ethan. Not now. The streets were eerily quiet as Gabriel's car sped through the city. He checked every possible place, the gym, the bus station, even the foster home where the boys had once lived. Every second that passed felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Then his phone rang. Elliot's voice was hoarse. "I think I know where he went." Gabriel didn't hesitate. "Tell me." Elliot swallowed. There's this abandoned lot, near the old train tracks. When we were kids, we used to hide there whenever we wanted to disappear. Gabriel tightened his grip on the wheel. I'm on my way. The train tracks were empty, ghostly under the moonlight. And then Gabriel saw him. Ethan sat near the edge of the platform, his knees pulled to his chest, his breath coming out in shaky gasps. Gabriel's chest ached. He had seen that kind of pain before, in himself, in every child who had ever been told they weren't wanted. Slowly, he stepped forward. Ethan. Ethan flinched, but he didn't look up. Gabriel's throat tightened. Talk to me. A bitter laugh. What's there to talk about? Gabriel sat down beside him, leaving just enough space so Ethan wouldn't feel trapped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan whispered, I don't belong anywhere. Gabriel exhaled slowly. That's not true. Ethan's voice wavered. Isn't it? My own father didn't want me. My grandmother couldn't keep me. And you're just some rich guy who feels guilty. Gabriel's heart clenched. That's not why I'm here. Ethan finally turned to look at him, his blue eyes burning. Then why? Gabriel met his gaze without hesitation. Because I care about you. Ethan swallowed. I don't know how to believe that. Gabriel hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out his father's old pocket watch, the only thing he had ever kept from his past. He placed it in Ethan's palm. This belonged to my dad, Gabriel said quietly. He was a hard man. He never had time for me. And by the time I realized I needed him, he was gone. Ethan stared at the watch, his fingers tightening around it. I spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would make up for what I lost, Gabriel continued. But the night I found you and Elliot in the snow, for the first time, I felt like I had done something that actually mattered. Ethan's breath hitched. I don't want to lose you, Gabriel whispered. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Gabriel smiled softly. Neither do I. A pause. Then, cautiously, Ethan leaned his head against Gabriel's shoulder. Gabriel closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. For the first time, Ethan wasn't running, and neither was he. They returned home just as the sun began to rise. Elliot was waiting on the steps, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But when Ethan stepped forward, Elliot immediately pulled him into a tight embrace. Gabriel watched them, his heart heavy. They were still healing, but they were together. And that was enough, for now. But the war wasn't over, because the next morning, a letter arrived. Mark wasn't done fighting, and this time, he was going to play dirty. Gabriel sat at the kitchen table, gripping the letter in his trembling hands. The words printed in bold, black ink burned into his mind. The man wasn't giving up. Gabriel exhaled slowly, pressing his thumb against his temple. His gut told him Mark had something up his sleeve, something far worse than legal tricks. Elliot and Ethan sat across from him, waiting for him to say something. What does it mean? Elliot finally asked. Gabriel placed the letter on the table. It means your father isn't done fighting. Ethan's jaw clenched. He's never wanted us before. Why now? Gabriel looked between them. Because he thinks he can win. Elliot's fists tightened. Then we make sure he doesn't. Gabriel nodded. We do this together. But none of them could have predicted just how far Mark was willing to go. That night, Gabriel met with Jason, his most trusted advisor, in his private office. Jason placed a thick folder on the desk. I found something. Gabriel opened it, his stomach dropping as he scanned the documents. Bank transfers, confidential emails, signed agreements, all leading back to his own company. His fingers curled into fists. Who helped him? Jason hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he slid another document across the desk. Gabriel's heart stopped when he saw the name. His assistant, his right-hand man. Gabriel's breath came fast and shallow. He gave Mark money? Jason's expression darkened. Not just money. He's been feeding him information about you, about the boys, everything. Gabriel's vision blurred with rage. Henry had been by his side for years, and all this time he had been betraying him. He played me, Jason nodded grimly, and he's still playing you. Gabriel's pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was war. Gabriel had faced many adversaries in his life, but none of them had been as personal as this. He needed leverage, something to break Mark before Mark could break them. So he went to the one place no one expected him to go. For 2 days, Gabriel worked with private investigators, pulling every record, every report. And then, finally, he found something that could destroy Mark's case forever. The next morning, Gabriel walked into his office, his face unreadable. Henry was already there, standing beside his desk as if nothing had changed. Gabriel closed the door behind him, locking it. "Sit," he ordered. Henry hesitated, then obeyed. Gabriel pulled out a file and placed it on the desk between them. "Tell me," Gabriel said, voice deadly calm. "How much did Mark pay you?" Henry's eyes flickered. "I don't—" Gabriel slammed his fist onto the desk. "Don't lie to me." Then Henry exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I did what I had to." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You sold out 2 kids. For what? Money? Power?" Henry's lips curled. "Mark offered me something you never did." Gabriel clenched his fists. "What?" Henry leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "A way to take you down." Gabriel stilled. Henry smirked. "You always thought you were untouchable. But Mark saw your weakness before I did." Gabriel narrowed his eyes. "And what's my weakness?" Henry's smile widened. "You care." Gabriel's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm, because Henry had just given him exactly what he needed. Gabriel stood, straightening his suit. "You made a mistake." Henry raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Gabriel picked up the file and tossed it onto Henry's lap. Henry frowned, flipping it open. As he read the first page, his face paled. "This is—" Gabriel smirked coldly. "Your resignation letter." Henry's jaw clenched. "You have nothing on me." Gabriel's voice was like steel. "I have everything on you." Henry swallowed hard. Gabriel leaned in. "You have 1 hour to clear out your office. If I ever see you again, I won't just take your job. I'll take everything." Henry hesitated. Then, without another word, he stood and walked out. Gabriel exhaled, pressing his hands against the desk. One enemy down. 1 to go. The next day, Gabriel walked into the courtroom with his secret weapon. Mark was already there, smirking, as if he had already won. Gabriel sat beside Elliot and Ethan, his presence steady, unwavering. The judge called the case to order. Then Mark's lawyer stood, as arrogant as ever. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has proven himself a changed man. He has financial stability. He has built a life ready for his sons. It is clear that granting him custody is the best decision." Gabriel remained still, silent. Then, when the lawyer was finished, Gabriel stood. "Your Honor," he said, "I have new evidence." The courtroom stirred. Mark's smirk faltered. Gabriel pulled out a folder and handed it to the judge. "This is a report from a private investigator," Gabriel explained. "It details Mark Halloway's recent gambling debts, his illegal dealings, his involvement in fraud." The judge's expression hardened. Mark shot to his feet. "Lies!" Gabriel turned to him, his voice cold. "You used your sons to gain sympathy in court, all while planning to sell their identities to pay off your debts." Gasps filled the room. Elliot and Ethan froze, their eyes widening. Mark's face twisted with rage. "This is enough." The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Mark's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. He knew they had lost. The judge turned to Mark. "You are hereby denied custody, and due to your actions you will be under further investigation for fraud." The gavel struck. It was over. Outside the courthouse, Gabriel inhaled deeply, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. Elliot and Ethan stood beside him. Free. Ethan looked up at Gabriel, his voice small. Did we win? Gabriel knelt before them. We did, he whispered, and I promise you, you'll never have to run again. Elliot swallowed hard. So, what happens now? Gabriel met his gaze. That's up to you. Then, cautiously, Elliot hugged him. Gabriel stiffened. Then slowly he wrapped his arms around the boy. Ethan hesitated. Then he joined. And for the first time, Gabriel didn't feel alone. He felt like a father, like he had finally found the family he didn't know he had been missing. As they stood there, holding on to one another, Gabriel knew this was just the beginning. The mansion was too big for just one man. It had always felt that way to Gabriel, even when he had first moved in. The ceilings stretched high, the walls lined with expensive artwork, the floors so polished they reflected the emptiness around him. For years, it had been nothing more than a carefully curated display of wealth, but tonight, for the first time, it felt like a home. Laughter echoed from the hallway, real, unrestrained laughter. Gabriel stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, something he hadn't done in years. He was used to private chefs and catered meals, but tonight was different. Tonight, his sons were home. Elliot walked in first, barefoot, his hair still damp from the shower. Something smells good. Gabriel smirked. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I haven't cooked in a while. Ethan peeked in next, his eyes suspicious. Is this edible, or are we ordering pizza? Gabriel chuckled. You'll survive. Elliot slid onto a stool at the kitchen island, watching him. There was something in his gaze. Something softer than before. Trust. Gabriel didn't take it for granted. Ethan, set the table, Elliot said. Ethan groaned but obeyed, grabbing plates and utensils. Gabriel glanced between them. This was new for all of them, this normalcy, this togetherness. But God, did it feel right? After dinner, Gabriel found himself standing in his home office, staring at an old photograph. It was from the night he had first found Elliot and Ethan. The memory was so vivid. The snow, the cold, the fear in their eyes. And now, 10 years later, they were here. Behind him, Elliot lingered in the doorway. Are you okay? Gabriel turned, smiling faintly. Yeah, just thinking about how far we've come. Elliot stepped inside, his expression unreadable. I didn't think we'd end up here. Gabriel nodded. Me neither. Then Elliot hesitated. You never gave up on us. Gabriel exhaled. I never will. Elliot studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then he turned, walking away. Gabriel watched him go, his chest tightening with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Later that night, Gabriel sat on the balcony, sipping a glass of water when Ethan stepped outside. The younger boy hesitated before sitting beside him, kicking his legs against the railing. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked, Are you going to adopt us? Gabriel's breath hitched. He turned, searching Ethan's face, but the boy was staring at his hands, picking at his sleeve. Would you want that? Gabriel asked cautiously. Ethan shrugged. I don't know, I don't want to go anywhere else. Gabriel swallowed hard. You won't, he promised. Ethan nodded, his shoulders relaxing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I think I'd like it. Gabriel closed his eyes for a brief second, his chest tightening. When he opened them, he smiled. Then we'll make it happen. And for the first time, Ethan smiled back. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the backyard. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, and for once Gabriel wasn't thinking about board meetings, contracts, or court battles. He was just here. Elliot and Ethan sat on the grass, throwing a football back and forth, their laughter ringing through the air. It was an ordinary evening, but to Gabriel, it was everything. He exhaled deeply, watching them, still struggling to believe that this was real. A year ago, they had been strangers. Now, they were his sons. The adoption papers had been finalized that morning. It was official. They weren't just two boys he had saved one winter night. They were home. Elliot caught the football and turned to Gabriel. "Are you just going to sit there, or are you actually going to play?" Gabriel chuckled, pushing himself up. "You think you can take me?" Ethan smirked. "You're old." Gabriel narrowed his eyes playfully. "All right, kid, let's see what you got." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gabriel Thornton, a man who had once believed he was destined to be alone, ran across the grass, laughing, playing, living, for the first time in his life. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a father, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. Gabriel's story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stay, the ones who fight for us, even when we push them away. How many times do we let fear keep us from accepting love? How often do we run from the very people who are trying to save us? Elliot and Ethan had every reason to doubt, to believe they weren't worth fighting for. But Gabriel proved them wrong. And maybe, just maybe, that's a lesson we can all learn. Have you ever misjudged someone, only to realize they were the best thing that ever happened to you? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more emotional stories that remind us what truly matters. Because sometimes, the people we least expect become the ones we can't live without.